Oh, this is a little bit tongue in cheek, to be honest, about what do your finances say about you? Because first off, I'm not talking about you as a person. I am talking about your organizations, though. People have more and more access to your finances, whether it is through 990 forms and trying to glean what they can. Some of you post audited financials on a website or provide them if asked. And clearly, some of the funders out there now are asking for a pretty clear financial picture of where you're at. So everybody's seeing your finances. So we might as well embrace it and think about how we message around what our finances mean. So that's what we're talking about today. I'll always put that out there that I am not a CPA, and we have great CPAs that we can put you in touch with if you ever were interested in that. But I am just playing one on TV. Okay, so just a bit about me. I do teach nonprofit finance. In fact, I see a few of my students and former students in class and or in the session, and really appreciate seeing you all here. But I study, believe it or not, sick nonprofits. So I'll talk a little bit about accounting ratios, very simple ones. And I apply these accounting ratios to all 1.5 million nonprofits in the US, looking at big patterns of what communities are served by sort of financially ill nonprofits. And so I have a larger sort of meta level discussion about what policy should be, where funders should be aiming funding and the like. Okay, so as you know, when we think about nonprofits, you have many masters. You have the people of Missouri, Kansas, the United States. You incorporate in a state. Therefore, you are guided by the laws that control what happens in that state. So that's where an attorney general or a secretary of state can sanction nonprofits. Also, you just have citizens who are going to look at your finances or look at you. You have clients. And so you have people who are using your services, whether you are an art museum and you have people coming through the door, or performing arts organization, people buying tickets, or whether you are a community health organization and you have patients. You're all these people are clients. And the real unique challenge that we talk about a lot in our program here at UMKC is that you have people who pay who may be different than the people who are receiving services. And so when you have, for example, a community health organization and you are finding that you're getting money from Medicaid, maybe from Medicare, so you have federal influence, you have state influence because Medicaid is governed by state rules. You may have some foundation money, and different foundations have different interests. They all could be different interests than your patients. And therefore, you're going to have to constantly balance those interests. And as you know, it's a very tricky balancing act. We'll talk a little bit about dollars that are restricted versus unrestricted, and sort of opportunities and costs with those types of dollars. And then ultimately, we all have a different bottom line. And our stakeholders all have a different idea of what that bottom line is. So maybe a funder is funding you at a program level and they want to see impact in that program and they really don't care about anything else. Maybe you have a philanthropist, maybe somebody on your board who has a particular interest in a different bottom line. So again, you're constantly trying to message out what you're trying to achieve and why it's important for what you're trying to do. You have different access to capital. We'll talk a little bit about that today. It's not a focus, but if you have a question, we can talk about that. So whether it is a line of credit that your nonprofit has, maybe it's a business credit card, maybe it's your own personal wallet, who knows? Those are all access to capital. Maybe you own your building and you can have a mortgage against that. We have different feedback mechanisms, how we communicate with stakeholders. And so today we'll definitely focus on how you feedback information and the appropriate information to different stakeholders. And then we all have just different flows of money. So we have some very large, tens of millions of dollars nonprofits in town, big hospital systems, for example. And then we have wonderful organizations that also have a flow of dollars that are measured in the thousands, single thousands. And those are all wonderful, but you really can't have an apples to apples discussion when you're talking about those scopes of size. So the theme today is accountability. So this is kind of the stick aspect of the carrot and stick. So accountability is just so important. Boards are entrusted by a state to take charge of the accountability for that organization. They are the fiduciaries, so they're signing on the bottom line. And so they're also voluntary. We all live boards. In fact, we're doing our advanced boards course with Dave Renz right now. And so people, the citizens of Missouri, Kansas, are putting their trust in our boards to make good financial decisions. Yet, as we know, our boards are putting in extra time on the side to make it happen. And sometimes they are not tracking with these financial choices. Other times they are tracking very, very closely, as you know, and sometimes that can be a thorn in the side, frankly, of some executive directors. We all know that board member who really, really has a particular interest, a financial interest, and they look at your accounts very closely just for that interest. So that's just to say we all have accountability pressures. So I don't want to talk about risk as much as I want to talk about opportunity. So in our organizations, there's real risk. The Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership also, we have risk. We have employees. So I'll sometimes talk about what we do. We have to have a revenue stream that's stable in order to support our overhead, our client, or our salaries. Also, we have to, chip in for these fancy university buildings and whatnot. So we constantly are thinking about stability and scale. So what we really want to think about is, how do we create part of our financial system that is stable, that is going to be there thick and thin year on year? And how are we going to create a part of our financial system that is going to allow for scale, meaning opportunity and innovation? It's not easy. I fight that every day. I'm also an associate dean for budget and finance at the Block School. So at a school level too, we're constantly thinking about stability and scale, sustainability and scale. And you can't have one without the other. So you can't have scale if you aren't sure you're going to pay salaries next month. At the same time, if you have great stability, but you aren't able to innovate, maybe next year that funder is not as interested in what you're doing to go out and affect your community. So they go hand in hand. We have to think about the risks inherent in your work. You have to think about liabilities and the like. And again, that's not necessarily the subject today, but pop any questions you have into the chat, and we'll certainly at the end have time to chat about these liabilities also, because they show up as costs, whether they are insurance costs, whether they are costs just in the sense of something drastic happens to your organization, you have to pay for whatever just happened. I love this photo. So this is, I'll give due credit to it. It's from the Parks and Rec in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So I pulled it off, but it really, speaks to the balancing act that we all have when it comes to money and mission. So, I teach in a business school, right? So the nonprofit program's fairly small but mighty. I love my students. But we are in a school surrounded by finance professors. And they think that these cute little charities just do their nice little, church basement raffles and whatever. And that's wonderful. I'm not saying that. But what I would say is that go ahead and try and run a nonprofit financially, and then we'll talk about how easy or hard nonprofit finance is, because you're continually trying to balance mission and money. And so you have to continually really think about how you're going to, frankly, sell your mission, whether that mission is to people in the audience at your theater production, or it's a funder that wants the newest, greatest, whatever it might be. So you have to sell your mission, and you have to pay for it too. And so this is not an easy thing, as we all know. We need to ensure timely and accurate financial data for decision makers. So with your organizations, hopefully you have a system where you're able to fairly easily pull your financial data and look at it in a timely manner. I know with Midwest Center, Mark and I sit down with our finances on Monday mornings, and we discuss where we're at, what we spent last week, where we're going this week. Those are just touch points. But then we have to also think about providing information at a higher level, whether it's on a monthly iteration or whether it's on a quarterly iteration, whether it's to your board, a finance subcommittee, for example, whether it's to your accounting or bookkeeping organization. These are all times where you have to provide that accurate information. You have to continually assess your financial condition. So we're going to talk about a couple ratios where on the back of a napkin, I swear to God, you can do it. So if you can do simple division on your iPhone calculator, you can go ahead and calculate these ratios. You need to think about the positive things. How are you going to plan? What are you going to do with your reserves? Reserves are not meant to be stuck in a bank. Reserves are meant for all sorts of interesting, fun opportunities. And then how do you communicate out to all of your stakeholders, whether it's internal to say, hey guys, this is where we're at, this is what we're looking at, whether it is your board or whether external funders. So here's the fun thing, which is really thinking about your strategy. So as you know, our finances have all gone a bit bonkers in the past couple years with COVID-19. Whether that is the financial hit that organizations took in the immediate aftermath of COVID-19, whether it might be a bubble of funding that you may have gotten because of COVID-19. For example, there is ARPA funding out there, which is the relief funding after COVID. And that's created quite a bubble. And so what that allows you to do is have really good discussions with your board, with your executive staff, with your funders about what do we do with where we're at and where do we go from here. So never think of strategy as a static thing where you just did a planning process, it goes in the binder up on the wall. Think about this as a continual process of where you're thinking about where you are and where you can go. And then you have to communicate that strategy out to, again, in concentric circles, your staff. Then you communicate it out to your board, and then you communicate it out to funders, whether actual or potential funders, and clients and the like. So communication is as important to finance as anything else. So strategic decisions are really important, as you know. You need to think about how your immediate decisions in operations and tactics roll up to your strategy. So for example, say you have some ARPA money left over. I'm working with the city of Kansas City right now. I'll be honest, they have a lot of COVID money from the federal government around, and they have the unique challenge of how they actually strategically understand where they want to move the money and what they can do with it. They have to continually check back and say, well, what's our strategy as a city? Much like with your nonprofit, we have a slug of federal money. It has to be spent by the end of 2024. Do we hire a new employee who can build out a new program? Are we worried that at the end of 2024, that money is going to go away? Do we think about investing that money? Of course, you can't with ARPA money. They want that money to move through the system. You can't stick it in an investment vehicle. So you have all these choices where you're constantly looking at your strategy and saying, yes, we can do this. No, we can't do that. And that should be something you're doing very, very regularly. So if you all were able to attend our conference on April Fool's Day, April 1st, we had Jeannie Bell speak to us partly about sustainability and scale. And so Jeannie wrote a wonderful book, and she articulated there are 8 sort of guiding principles that we should do when we're thinking about our financial model. First is you need to use your annual budget. Some organizations get all verklempt about money, right? And so it's always, you sort of you put it to the side, or you have a director of finance. Here at the Block School, that's me, right? So I'm like the guy who gets to sweat the budget, and then everybody else can do the happy, good things that our school does. But really, you should activate it, meaning you should have continual discussions about this is what it is, very coherently, very clearly, at the appropriate levels. So staff should also understand your budget, certainly. You should also communicate that so they understand choices and the like. You need to think about income diversification. We've talked about it quite a bit at the Midwest Center. I know Nonprofit Connect talks about it a lot, and it's just out there. We should think about having more than one income source. I'll be honest, there are some organizations where that's just not in the cards, that you always will have, maybe if you are a federally qualified health center, Medicaid is going to be the core of what you get as far as your revenue, and that's okay. So let's not thump you over the head about the fact that that's your large revenue model. At the same time, if we're thinking about sustainability, stability versus scale, you do have to have enough eggs in that basket, so that you can, if any funding source rolls out of your basket, that you're still able to achieve your strategic goals. I will say I did a series of research studies in 2010, 2011, funded by the Gates Foundation, about income diversification. And we actually found that organizations that took one more government contractor grant we're something like 20% more likely to go under. So as you know, taking a government grant or contract involves a lot of accountability and a lot of costs that go along with it. So if you have an ARPA, grant or contract right now, you understand the reporting requirements are intense. So don't think that every time you diversify, you're better off. You need to strategically think about how you add in new funding streams, or else you're just adding in more cost on the back end to track with it. You want to prioritize cash flow. We'll talk a bit about over the course of your year. You want to make sure you have adequate cash flow to plan out, a good sort of way of thinking about it is look at your past 5 years and look at your cash flow over the course of the year. When do big expenses hit? Maybe it's an annual lease. Maybe it is, a mortgage that you're paying monthly. It's clearly going to be salaries that occur, bi-monthly, monthly. So you have to sort of think about how you're going to have that cash flow happen from an expense side and a revenue side. When does your big, Kaufman grant? When does your funding from whatever funder come in? Your gala, your fundraiser. Rethinks restricted funding. And this is something that I've been talking a lot with funders about, and I want you to talk a lot with funders about. There are some large funders in the region who are actually rethinking restricted funding, and I want us as a group to continue that dialogue. Some funders like to lock down their funding, and as they should in their minds, and say it's only for this purpose. We need to rethink about operations and how important it is to have flexibility within your organization to be innovative. If you're locked down, if you have 4 major grants and they're all restricted in one special way versus another special way, you are so hamstrung in a lot of ways that you cannot go out and say, let's start a new program. And I think we have to message to our funding community that we want to be able to not only provide wonderful services today, but we need to think about providing wonderful services tomorrow and the next day. And that is through innovation, the ability to have some loosening around restrictions so that we can go ahead and innovate. You have to actually staff the finance function. If you have somebody on staff, that's a wonderful benefit. If not, there are really great firms here in town who can staff up your, whether it's controller, whether it's a bookkeeping function, depending on what you need. You can buy some time with them. It's well worth your investment, I believe. A really good financial professional will help you understand not only risk but opportunity with your money, and that's something that I think a lot of executive directors get a lot of comfort in when they're able to do that. Involve your board. It should be something where you are having, continual discussions, if you have a finance chair, if you have a finance committee, about opportunities, not just risk. And you need to manage the right risks, and you need to talk to your board about that. For example, maybe you have an insurance professional on your board who is thinking about liability a lot, and have good discussions about what liability means, but don't get fixated on it. Put some dollar amounts on it. Think about that, and think about how you can create conversations about beyond just liability. So we have to think about liquidity. We have to think about how you pay your salaries every month, how you deal with those expenses like the roof failing or the boiler failing in your building. You have to understand that liquid assets, cash, can be counted against you. And we'll look at an example in a moment by some funders. So they look at cash on hand as not moving, not cycling through your operations, through your programming. And there's some reality to that. And then there's a real communications opportunity to sort of talk about, well, what cash on hand means for your organization. It does mean that you can innovate when you know that you have money in the bank, that you aren't going from hand to mouth, and that's wonderful. But at the same time, cash that's sitting under the mattress from your nonprofit is not earning a return. And so these are conversations that you should have. I'll speak for my family, not for yours, but at a family budget level, when you have some money in your savings account, you're more likely to feel like, hey, we can go out and we can do something fun, right? And so we shouldn't be knocked over the head by having some money in the bank. At the same time, there comes a time where your liquidity, your cash on hand, can be too much. And those are really good discussions to have with your financial professional or with your finance chair on the board. So this really gets to how funders, dare I say, a charity navigator or any of those sort of organizations might look at having cash on your balance sheet. There are specialized ratios where we can look at whether you have too much cash or not too much cash. And those are really important also to think about. Don't worry, I'm winging through these slides, but you have access to them. I know Mark has put them in the chat also. Okay, so whenever you are getting a new piece of revenue, you also need to consider how this affects other choices. So, for example, those organizations that are lucky enough that you have maybe a major donor, maybe it is a foundation. For example, the Sunderland Foundation in the community has been very generous over the years with buildings. Those are assets, but then those also represent costs. So you have to think about flexibility or not. Think about the fact that during downturns, you want to own your building, or do you want to have the flexibility in renting the building? Kind of flips on the head the logic in our personal finances. The narrative has always been about go invest in your house, get equity in your house, which is a great personal finance strategy. When you are a nonprofit, you have to think about, do I want this building? COVID-19 has really highlighted the fact that some employees want to work from home. And now I have this legacy asset, I have this building that becomes a liability. I have all this space. So you have to think about any time you get, that magic grant or gift coming through the door, think about it as an asset, but also what's the liability attached to it. And ultimately, what does that mean for your programming? If we have to put money aside for the broken boiler in the basement, that might mean we have less money for our programming. So we won't go into the whole full-on Dan Pallotta overhead discussion, but happy to have that discussion. Talked about cash flow, so we'll move on. So you want to implement systems where you are going to be able to track with your finances very easily and quickly. This is easier said than done. We have a major project with the state of Missouri right now, and for them to even pull their own financials for their own particular units takes a lot of effort. Their system is written in COBOL. So COBOL is a programming language from the 1960s, and they have to actually contract with a woman who retired many years ago to come in and to actually pull their financials to understand where they're at. We want to create systems not like that. We want to create systems that are open and easy for you to access. If you're a very small organization, you can even think about, a Google Sheet that gets locked down just for you and your staff. If you're larger, clearly you want to use one of the bookkeeping softwares out there. I have always some systems in here from these examples where it didn't go well when the system wasn't there. And clearly a finance professional, again, a controller, is going to help you with this. So we want to create a culture where you're going to see month on month, week on week, any sort of variance in what you budgeted and what you actually are spending. This is something that really helps you out. Don't think of an annual budget as a one and done. So we come back at the end of the fiscal year, we take all of our receipts, all of our expenses, and we see where we're at. As prices are changing rapidly right now, whether it's wages and salaries, as you hire on new people, maybe you have given folks a pay raise, whether it's utility bills, as we know in our homes, utility bills are going up at a rapid clip. You need to engage your budget and understand that it's okay that you were wrong. It's okay. It's not okay to say, well, we're going to wait until January at the end of the fiscal year to see where we're at. That's not an okay impulse. So employ your annual budget at the very least month on month, so that you can say, hey, we budgeted X amount for utilities and we were 23% over this month. And so that we can think about, where are we going to pick up utilities? What other part of our budget are we going to be able to do that? Because it is pretty disastrous when you get to the end of the year and you can't do that. Also, try to not engage in magical thinking about the funding that will come through the door. As we know, funders have different rhythms and different needs. And so you may think, gosh, we got this big foundation grant in the bag, and it might drag on for 3 or 4 months beyond when you thought it was going to happen. And therefore you're creating sort of financial pressures on yourself. Okay, let's go ahead and look at a statement of financial position. So I'm going to go ahead and change my screen just a second here. We'll sort of see how this plays out. So I have here a nonprofit that I think very highly of. It's the National Council of Nonprofits. I've worked with them before. It's a national organization. It's a professional association for nonprofits. Some of you may be members of the National Association of Nonprofits. A lot of their work is in advocacy and lobbying in Washington, D.C. on behalf of nonprofits. So I believe they're a 501c4. All right. But if we go ahead and they do a great thing, they put their financials right out there on the website. So everybody can sort of see where they're at. If we look at the statement of financial position, and let me go ahead and make it just a little bit bigger. So this is a fairly simple statement of financial position. This is what you would call a balance sheet. And so this gives you a 30,000 foot view of where this organization is financially. I'm going to give you guys a minute to look at this, and go ahead and pop in the chat what you think, any elements that you think are interesting or important off this balance sheet. What story is this balance sheet telling us about this organization? Right. They have some really good things happening, right? So you go ahead and you look at it. Some of the good things we'll talk about on the asset side, right? The in the black side of the sheet. Their investments did really well. They, had almost a doubling of their investments, for example. Yeah, good. A good amount of unrestricted assets. We'll talk about that down below. Their cash is really strong, and we'll look at other aspects of their budget, but cash in the bank is really, really strong. What we can, and Roshni, you're right. So I think that's a potential discussion point of, hey guys, why are you sitting on so much cash? What's the problem? Shouldn't you be, if I was a member, right? I'm paying my dues, maybe it's $2,500 a year. It's hard for my organization to scrape together $2,500, and you're sitting on 1.3 million in cash. That's a discussion that a member would want to talk about, a client. We see down below on the liabilities, the red on the sheet, right? PPP loans come in, and so PPP loans are a liability when they're a loan. So this is their 2020 budget. So this was before that it was forgiven. So remember, I know many of you also face this too, that on your balance sheet, on your statement of financial position, depending on your financial year, fiscal year, you had 1 year where you had a large liability because it was a loan, and then it gets forgiven, and on the very next year it shows up as very positive on your balance sheet, because in effect it becomes a grant, right? So it becomes revenue. So this is a unique thing that's happened to nonprofits. I sort of think of like the pig going through the snake. So it's kind of a lump of money that moves through your balance sheet. So there was a good question about deferred rent, and I actually had to look it up. So in this statement at the end, they have, in fact, I'll pop this in the chat, the website. So if you want to go look at the statement, but they have a fancy Washington office suite, and basically they have to book the future lease amount on their liabilities, or they decide to put that on their liability side of the sheet, because they have a very expensive lease amount that they have to pay into the future. I don't know exactly why they decided to do that, but that's where that shows up. And then down here, we see those organizations that have, or those assets that have donor restrictions, and those that don't have donor restrictions. So it feeds into our discussion about whether you should, have unrestricted money. We all would love it. And if we get donor restricted money, what does that mean for our financial choices? So the next part of a budget that you should be looking at and thinking about what the story is, we'll go through this a little less in a fine-tooth way, but is your statement of activities. This is a way of you to drill down into your revenue and your expenses. So again, we see, for example, that membership dues went down in that year. And that might be a COVID-19 thing. Fees for service went down. So for example, they'll have trainings where members pay $50 for the training. You can imagine in COVID-19 that probably affected their fees for service. Their sponsorships went way down. So they have a big annual event. Clearly in COVID times, you didn't have those big events. And so sponsorships went down. So you end up seeing at a finer grain the choices that were made and sort of the contingencies that happened to this organization. On the program or on the expense side, what you end up seeing is that their advocacy work was largely the same, down a little bit. Communication work went up a little bit. Their lobbying activities went up quite a bit. And so it shows how they moved around their operations in 2020 as opposed to 2019. And then this supporting services is unfortunately where some maybe well-meaning and perhaps less well-meaning folks really fixate, which is fundraising costs. So this is sort of seen as overhead. So fundraising costs, as Kristen says, went up quite a bit. Not sure why they went up in that particular year, but you do have to, as you know, invest in fundraising in order to do well in future years. And general and administrative, anything that's not attached to programming, went down quite a bit. So who knows what happened there? All right, so that's a statement of activities. Sometimes you don't communicate this out to your external stakeholders. This is something that most likely would be internal to your organization. And then the last thing we'll look at today is a statement of functional expenses. So this again is drilling even one level further down and dividing it out into your functional areas. So as a 501c4, they do advocacy, and they talk about how each of their functional areas is partitioned out as far as expenses and revenue. This here at this level is an excellent tool for discussion with your board and with your particularly executive staff, but even your staff, to be able to say, look, guys, insurance went up by this amount, and this is what we have to talk about. Or travel, travel, for example, didn't really happen in 2020. So our travel budget was much less, for example. So a statement of functional expenses is a really good document for a conversation. So with that, I want to leave 10 minutes here at the end for questions and discussions about the material I presented today. So go ahead. How about you just either raise your hand or chime in, and we'll go ahead and get to your question. So Britton, you have a question.
Yeah. Hey, Dr. Never. Good to see you again.
I see you.
Yeah, I had a question about nonprofits that rely on government money. So in my job, we work with a lot of home health agencies, and most of their funding, I believe, comes from Medicaid. How do you recommend flexibilities for those companies under those circumstances? Do you recommend them like diversify their income or what?
Yeah, Medicaid is great and awful all at once. So Britton, you work in this area. For those of you who work in health, you know that Medicaid, reimbursement rates are very, very below market rates, depending on the state, Kansas versus Missouri, but they are very stable. So I would view it as a stabilizing influence, but depending on the service you provide, it may not meet costs. And so you have to sort of keep that in mind, but definitely if you're thinking about stability versus scale, it goes in the stability corner. Medicaid rates, reimbursement rates rarely go down. They sometimes go up. So again, it's a good thing, although not an unvarnished good thing, right? Does that answer your question?
Yes. And I guess just kind of a follow-up. Sure. So people who expect like Medicaid or government funding, they shouldn't expect like a drop in funding at all?
Well, you should never say never, right? We live in interesting political times, but Medicaid funding generally has been stable. Now the problem is that sometimes it doesn't come up, react to inflation, and particularly inflation in the particular areas you're talking about as rapidly as it should.
Okay, that answers it. Thank you, Dr. Never.
Yep. Kim, you have a hand up.
Yes, you had teased with some ratios that you were going to share.
Yep, let's go ahead and look at those. Let me stop the share here and give you a new share. Okay. Perfect. All right, so we'll go ahead and we'll look at a couple ratios. So we'll look at current ratio and quick ratio. These measure some liquidity. So the first ratio, a current ratio, is very simple, right? So it looks at what are your current assets versus your current liabilities. So this is the most basic ratio you can sort of come up with. And it's just a back of the napkin kind of way of saying, this is where we are in case our HVAC goes out and we have to call the HVAC person and pay $10,000. Where are we? What ideally you would like to do is to be able to calculate this over the past couple of years to sort of see the humps and bumps that have happened to you over the time, so that you can get a sense of like, what's a good ratio. So last week I talked about this with another group, and they had really good questions about, well, what should my ratio look like? And as a professor, I did my professor type thing, which is I said, well, it depends. And what I think you should do is to calculate these ratios over a 2 or 3 year period, and then to look at them and say, oh yeah, this is when the roof went out, and this is why we took a hit. And oh yeah, this is when whatever, revenue came in, and this is why we look so good. So that you can sort of peg the correct amount to your organization. So that's the current ratio. And then the quick ratio is really quick also. And this is where you're trying to understand your cash and investments over your liabilities. So this is your ability to dip into your liquidity if need be. Now, investments is one of these little asterisks to sort of think about how liquid are those investments? So there are some investments that you are able to access if you really had to. Other investments that might be completely locked down, and you probably shouldn't include them in this ratio because they're so locked down. But again, this is a ratio that you should run over a 2 to 3 year period, and sort of look at the fluctuations you've had over time. Does that help, Kim? I have a ton of ratios. These are,
and these are kind of basic ones that which is very helpful. And you're right. Your ratios vary greatly depending on what kind of work you are doing. So you have to compare it to other organizations like you. Do you have any other insights? And I work with a lot of what I would call intermediary organizations that are both grant seekers and grant makers. And any advice on pushing back on funders to get more unrestricted funding? Yes,
I think, well, on that front, Kim, so on two fronts. I have a series of ratios that if you would like to have a discussion on offline, we could sort of think about ratios that work for you. Your finance professional should, you should have a discussion with him or her about creating some ratios that would work for you. Ratios are good because they don't depend on the actual amount, they depend on the ratio of the amount, so you can compare them year on year. So that's a wonderful aspect of them. As far as funders and having this discussion, I think it takes a village, guys. We all have to be out there having similar discussions and having discussions about the innovation side of the ledger. Some funders just want you to do the programming that you've done, and that's wonderful, and maybe they don't want to engage in that discussion. But if you want to engage them in that discussion of how do we next year be better than this year, and how in 5 years do we create new programming that's going to wrap around for our clients, those are all discussions I think funders really do want to have. And whether, and so their inclination would be, well, let me fund you in a restricted way to go out and do that new program. And you have to back them off and say, actually, what would be more helpful is for you to think about unrestricted funds to allow us to create this new idea that's yet to be determined. And there's still accountability. You still, at the end of the year, will have to come back to them and say, you know what? With your unrestricted funds, this didn't work out for me, and that is what it is. Kimberly, you have a question here. Any insight on how much cash on hand is too much, too little? What you really need to do, Kimberly, on that front is you need to look at your expenses over the course of a 3 to 5 year period. And go ahead, map those out and look at the ones that are stable expenses. For example, maybe you're locked into a lease that's a 3 year lease, that's a stable expense, and look at those expenses that are unstable, meaning you couldn't understand what they would have been. And then you can go ahead and think about how much cash you need to deal with the pop-up expenses. So really you want to pick the longer timeline to map this out. Janelle?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Never. I was just wondering, in projections for finances, you have things on the forecast like cybersecurity, things that have maybe never been in your budget before. Do you have a good resource that you can kind of project out like future, like we never knew that we'd all have to subscribe to Zoom, right?
Right.
So, like these subscriptions or expenses that are going to pop up, is there a good way to forecast?
So I can't give you a number, but I will say some functional areas that we have to think about are, just like you said, Janelle, tech expenses and human capital expenses, meaning tech, wages and salaries, and benefits. Those are some of the areas that are having a lot of flux right now, as you know, and something that you should budget in a buffer. So like you said, cybersecurity. What if you're working with client documents and somebody hacks into your system and all of a sudden you have a liability, a very real liability out there? You have to have the correct insurance, first off. And second off, you are going to have enough of a buffer to deal with that potential issue. Okay, so we are at 9:32. I kept you 2 extra minutes. Please go ahead and fill out the feedback form. It's really helpful to us. We use it each and every time. It takes only a minute. We absolutely love having you here. Thanks for spending your time with us. And we'll look forward to seeing you in a future program.